everyone, and thank you so much for investing your time with us today. My name is Vanessa Duarte, and I am the head of training for Adecco Canada. Today, we have a powerful conversation planned for you. There's been an ongoing struggle for gender equality in the workplace for decades, and the recent COVID-19 pandemic has underscored the issue, even more so throughout the past 17 months. Between February and October of 2020 in Canada alone, 20,600 women fell out of the labor force, while nearly 68,000 men joined. Those 20,600 were a combination of women who had to self-select out and those whose jobs were eliminated. The three main factors driving the exit from the workforce for women were childcare, caregiving, slow recovering industries, and lack of skills. As Canada continues to reopen and we prepare for the next normal and a return to the workplace, now is the time to address the factors that resulted in women stepping out of the workforce, and how can we support not only their reentry, but ensure that they can thrive in workplaces that work for women. Our hosts today are two incredible women whose commitment to leading the way for future generations of women to thrive in is both inspiring and it's a call to action. Joann S. Lublin is the former management news editor of the Wall Street Journal and remains a regular contributor. She created the journal's first career advice column and wrote it until 2020. She shared its 2003 Pulitzer Prize for stories about corporate scandals. She won the 2018 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Gerald Loeb Awards, the highest honor in business journalism. Joann's latest book about female business leaders is Power Moms, How Executive Mothers Navigate Work and Life. Her first book, published in 2016, is Earning It, Hard-Won Lessons from Trailblazing Women at the Top of the Business World. In her latest book, Joann interviewed 86 Power Moms. And one of those power moms is Janelle Bieler, who is also one of our hosts. Janelle Bieler was appointed as Adecco Canada's president in 2020, following her role as senior vice president for Adecco staffing in the US. In that role, Janelle was responsible for Adecco US's retail organization, encompassing more than 150 branch locations and over 200 sales leaders. She led and helped to accelerate the focus and growth within this important area of business. A passionate leader, Janelle developed and implemented new sales strategies to drive results. Prior to joining Adecco, Janelle worked in market leadership and sales with a large car rental company, a technology company, and a large staffing firm. Our conversation will be centered around addressing the biggest concerns for women re-entering the workforce. As a leading advocate for women, Joann has incredible insight, as well as decades of research to illustrate key areas women must start, stop, and/or maintain in order to thrive in our next normal job market. This will be a fascinating dialogue between Joann and Janelle on how to navigate work and life. Our hosts will answer questions such as, how can we educate women on how to make their voices heard? How can I support women entering the workforce? And how can I advocate for myself when I've been out of the workforce for an extended period of time? Our goal today is to offer you a fresh perspective, a new idea or strategy that can move you into a career that you, your family, and your colleagues will thrive in, as well as a call to action for all of us to continue the work done by the trailblazers profiled in Joann's book and advocate for workplaces that will work for the next generation. Let's get started. Joann, I think everybody would love to hear from you why Power Moms was so important for you to write.
Well, I appreciate the very kind introduction, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about the genesis of this book. I gave birth to this book, so to speak, because of what I learned from that first book, which was called Earning It. And for that book, I interviewed 52 high-ranking executive women in the US, of whom most ended up becoming public company CEOs. And when I took a closer look at those 52 women, not only were most of them also working moms, but the proportion who had children was even higher among those who became public company CEOs. And these were people like Mary Barra at General Motors, the first woman to run a major auto manufacturer in the US. And in that first book, I only devoted one chapter to the issue of being a working mom. And it was a chapter called Manager Moms Are Not Acrobats. And that was a direct quote from one of those 52 women who's actually making a repeat appearance in the next book, in this book. But given that all but one of those 52 women were baby boomers, that's where I got the kernel of an idea for the sequel. I wonder to what extent those boomers, who were really tremendous trailblazers, my generation, and who, as I said, most of them, of the ones I interviewed, turned out to have been mothers as well. I wondered whether life was any different, whether the juggle had gotten any easier for the next wave of women who were getting into executive roles in business and who were also having children. And so what I did is I interviewed 86 moms who had become executives from those two generations. Half were boomers and the other half were millennials and Gen Xers. About 2/3 of them were Gen Xers, so I call them the Gen X women. They were anywhere from their early 30s to their early 40s at the time that I did the reporting. In addition, I spoke to 25 adult daughters of the boomers to find out what was it like growing up having a mom who was a leader in the business world. And the most striking difference that I saw between those two generations was that indeed things had gotten better for the women of Janelle's generation, and had gotten better for three reasons. Number one was advances in technology. It's why we've been able, so many of us who've been lucky enough to have white collar jobs, we've been able to work from home for the last 18 months. And secondly was that the workplace had changed. Many companies had finally come to realize that you needed to address the personal needs of your employees, whether they were parents or not, that people did not stop being human beings when they became workers or when they came into the office. And part of that change in the workplace was because so many of the boomer moms were now in leadership roles and could serve as role models, mentors, sponsors. And the third change that has made a huge difference in the accomplishments and the gains that we're seeing among younger women is that life at home changed. Not perfect by a long shot, but women of Janelle's generation were not going to be like the boomer moms. They were not going to assume that the person they had chosen to live their life with, whether it was a husband or wife or just a life partner, was going to expect they were going to do everything in the home. So those were the three major causes behind what I describe as a generational shift.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, Joann, your book Power Moms, it reminds us that the trailblazers you profiled paved the road, but we still have so much work to do to ensure that the road reaches the correct destination. And I'm wondering do you feel that COVID has widened the gap the women in your book work tirelessly to close regarding the trade-off that women are forced to make between work and family?
I think what COVID demonstrated was that gap persists. But I don't think it caused it to widen. If anything, I think it caused it to narrow. And that's for two reasons. Number one, both parents suddenly found themselves at home with, in many cases, young children who had to be schooled from home. And several surveys suggest that dads, many of them did take up additional household duties that they weren't handling before, whether it was cooking, cleaning, or laundry. But nevertheless, the burden of childcare, particularly when kids were suddenly at home, and the burden of having to homeschool still fell squarely on mom's shoulders. And so the classic image that many of us have seen and many of us have lived is mom sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop and the kids sitting around her at the kitchen table who are school age with their laptops. And the one room in the house which is quiet and where you can work from in peace, dad's there. And I think that all gets back to this notion that this is not a road that we have finished going down. But nevertheless, we have proven that remote work and that work from home works, and that we can be productive employees. Amazingly, how some of these moms have been able to do that. But it has proven something that was frankly a very small scale experiment before, and it's not going to go away.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You reference a concept of work-life sway versus work-life balance. And I think many of us are all too familiar with the pressure aiming to balance life and work. I'd love if you could share with us what the idea of work-life sway versus work-life balance refers to.
It is a topic near and dear to my heart. In fact, when I submitted the manuscript for this book, literally the day before North America shut down in March of last year, its subtitle was very different than the one you see today. It was going to be called Power Moms, Lessons of Work-Life Sway from Two Generations of Executive Women. But my publisher rightfully said, we can't use that as a subtitle because no one will have any idea what you're talking about. And certainly I had not heard of this concept before I started reporting the book. I well knew that this idea of work-life balance was an impossible ideal. It was the equivalent of standing on one leg for a yoga pose with your bent leg held against the other one for 24/7. You can't do it. You can't maintain a yoga pose for 24 hours. And for the same reason, somehow trying to achieve perfect balance in our lives is not really realistic. But it was only when I started interviewing the Gen Xers and millennial women that I got introduced to this concept. And I had already spoken to a couple of such women when I met a woman who told me about this, really just in passing as I was walking out the door. But I was able to put it in the context of a story she had shared. And so the concept of work-life sway is that when we need to be 110% present for work, we give it our all and then some. But if life intrudes, whether it's children or an overflowing water heater or, the washing machine blows up, we sway in the moment and we become 110% present from whatever the demands are in our personal life. And we don't give ourselves huge grief about it. We don't give ourselves working mother or working father guilt over that. We know that when we need to sway, we will, and we can sway back and forth seamlessly as needed. And in the case of the woman who introduced me to this concept, the example she offered was being at the office in Manhattan late one afternoon, and a video popped up on text on her phone, and it was the nanny sharing with her a really short clip of her toddler son, her firstborn, taking his first steps. And it didn't bother her that she was able to do this while she was at work. In fact, she was thrilled that she was able to be part of his life at that moment. And so when then COVID forces us, many of us, the opportunity to work from home, women had to not only embrace work-life sway, but also recognize the need to establish boundaries when required and say, this is when I am available and this is when I'm not.
Mm-hmm. I love it. It's such a powerful concept. Janelle, the Gen X power moms that Joann featured in her latest book assertively embrace work-life sway. The concept really captured their view of reality, that moms deserve to thrive at home and at work. I'd love to know, do you feel that you have work-life sway in your day-to-day life? And if so, can you share an example of how adopting a work-life sway has made a positive impact for you?
Absolutely. I think my work-life sway is still a work in progress. It is something that I've gotten better at as I've taken more responsibilities, both with work and home. And like many of you, COVID threw all of that into overdrive. So I was in a situation like many of us on this webinar that my husband and I suddenly had to try and figure out work schedules as well as school schedules. I have two young daughters that are 8 and 4. So they were also of the age where they needed somebody side by side to kind of help them through school. So, all of a sudden we were thrust into, how do we schedule all of this? How do we start to really make this work so that you can continue to take work meetings, but still continue to be there for your kids? And then we threw an international move on top of that. So at the beginning of this year, I actually relocated from the US to Canada with Adecco for a promotion opportunity. But the couple of months leading up to that was not only trying to navigate working from home and managing work, managing school, but now we were also trying to do Zoom meetings with realtors so we could find a place to live, interviews with schools so our kids had somewhere to go when we moved to Canada. It was also the holiday season. So now we're trying to figure out how we make sure our kids have a great holiday and how we attend holiday, events and dance recitals and all these kind of things. They're all done in a virtual nature, but how do you schedule all of that? So I feel like we got really good at figuring out how to sway, whether that meant that we were maybe working after hours or taking time in the afternoons to be with our kids when things like the work appointments were taking up time during the day. We figured it out. So I think that was a really positive example because my kids didn't feel like they missed out on anything. They still felt like they got a great experience with the move. Work didn't feel like we missed a beat, and even the kids' school didn't feel like we missed a beat. So we were able to kind of work through it together. And Joann, you said something that really has stuck with me, and it's a chapter in your book that I absolutely love when you talk about ditching the guilt. So I've got my Power Moms book here. It's chapter 10. If you have not gotten to it yet, you need to read it because it is 10 tips on how you can ditch the guilt and really practical things that you can do to help you really sway like a pro. I've read it, I reread it. When I'm overwhelmed, I go back to it. So it's been a huge help to me too, right? And really learning how to be better at this in my work-life sway.
And one of those 10 hacks, of course, is embracing work-life sway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Exactly.
Amazing. Thanks, Janelle. As we move forward, we are going to be addressing several of the submitted questions by the audience. Please feel free to type any additional questions in the chat. And if we cannot address them today, we will address them on our website where this recorded webinar will be posted. Here's a question I have for you, Joann. Why is unconscious bias still lingering in 2021?
Well, first let's define the terms because not everybody knows what that term means. Unconscious bias is something that we all have to have in order to navigate our environment. If we didn't know that this was a computer and we thought it was a sheet or a blank, curtain, we would walk into it and not be the wiser. And so the whole idea of unconscious bias is to heighten our awareness of ways in which we are biased towards individuals without kind of being aware of it. And I got educated about unconscious bias a number of years ago when I wrote a story about it for the Wall Street Journal. And one of the companies that was offering unconscious bias training to their employees invited me to a training session. And the first exercise that they had us do when we broke up into groups was we were given a bunch of resumes and told to rank order them as to which candidate, if we were the hiring manager, we would hire first. And to the extent that people found a resume where the person had gone to their alma mater, they put that resume on top. And that was an example of unconscious bias. The reason unconscious bias persists today is mainly because of the fact there's not very much awareness of it, because of the fact that while some companies in the US and Canada do offer unconscious bias training, not enough of them do, and they don't require it on any kind of regular rotation. And it's something that ought to be, it seems to me, mandatory from the board of directors on down to the most recent hourly hire. On some kind of regular frequency, because our definition and expectation and what is or isn't unconscious bias is always going to be changing. But because of unconscious bias, we still have gendered role expectations. And that may, for instance, go a long way to explain why relatively few dads who were working from home during the pandemic did not take on additional childcare duties, because of the gendered role expectations that moms remain the primary parent. So that's why we're still having all this in my mind.
And that is a great segue, because you reference in your book that working mothers work an unpaid third shift, serving as CEO of their hectic households. So why do you feel, and what have you seen, that why do women still have to be the CEO of the household?
It goes beyond the notion of unconscious bias, and it goes beyond this notion of gendered role expectations. But that, of course, is part of the explanation. Reason why women remain the quote CEO of the household is they choose to take on that role, either because it's what they want to do, or they think that they're better at it. And frankly, I think, again, that was a more prevalent practice and expectation in the boomer generation than it is in Janelle's generation, but it's something that's hard to let go of. I remember one of the younger power moms, when I was interviewing her, she was talking about the fact that, you know, in her household, if her husband didn't do half the laundry, it wouldn't get done, and she didn't care, you know, if he had dirty clothes. Same thing with getting their child dressed and ready for daycare in the morning. Their child at that point was a toddler. She said she just wasn't willing to sort of take on all of these role expectations, and that if he wanted to send their son to daycare with mismatched socks and shoes and a shirt that was on backwards, she was going to let it happen. And so we kind of need to, it seems to me, also let go of our expectations that we are going to be perfect, and our expectations that we're the only ones who know how to do it right. And with that, then we will give up this idea that we have to be the CEO of the household. And it seems to me that a third thing that we could do to sort of remedy that stereotype is by setting expectations early in a long-term relationship. When you and the person that you decide you want to spend your life with, whether it's a husband, a wife, a domestic partner, or just the guy that or gal that you really love, when you make that commitment to each other, that's when you need to have that frank conversation as to whose career is going to be more important, or do we want to be a two-career couple? How will we decide when one of us wants to step back, whether the other person's okay with that, or the other person wants to become the stay-at-home parent? What are we going to do about the idea of being co-parents, and what do we think that means? And then let's revisit this from time to time as situations and life circumstances. Who would have thought we would be living through 18 months of a pandemic? And so you revisit that agreement. In the case of my husband and me, we actually drew up a formal written marriage contract when we decided to get married.
I love that. I love that you wrote in the domestic labor in your marriage contract. I thought that was an amazing chapter. Janelle,
and the one sentence that survived the legalese that the lawyer put our contract in was the sentence that my fiance wrote. And that was that household duties shall be shared equally, but not necessarily cheerfully.
Yeah, I love that. Janelle, Joann acknowledges that the Gen X women she interviewed still carry a burdensome mental load because they accept the popular presumption that the mother should be the primary parent. Do you have any innovative approaches that you and your partner to both commit to your careers and your family?
So, you know, I was not as proactive as Joann with kind of outlining that before we have had kids, but I think we have started to figure it out along the way and had a lot of different conversations to try and figure out who would do what. And I'm so lucky that I'm supported by such an incredible husband. He's actually watching with my two daughters because they love to watch mom work now that they can see things remotely. And we have really worked hard to do a couple of things. So there's three things I think that really work for how we tend to manage and be co-CEOs of the household. So one, we divide and conquer. So we figure out who's better apt at dealing with the more daily tasks. So my husband has a lot more flexibility in the working hours that I work. So he's able to handle some of the school responsibilities and daily tasks while I take on maybe more of the event type tasks, which might be buying the kids, you know, new clothes for school or organizing a birthday party or things of that nature. So we divide and conquer what we kind of are each going to take on. Secondly, we communicate a lot, right? So there's not only the shared calendar, which I know a lot of people do, but we kind of look at what are the tasks, because sometimes you have to flip things around. I might have something coming up at work that's, you know, hugely important, and I need to ask him to step in and handle something I was previously doing, and vice versa. So communicating that and making sure that we can be flexible enough to shift and change. And then I think outsourcing is probably the third one. So we got probably really good at this during COVID, as many people did. But, you know, whether it's your groceries or online shopping, I mean, we're really good friends with our Amazon driver at this point, but you have to outsource those things. If there are tasks that you can outsource and take off of your plate or your partner's plate, I think that's also key in making sure that the workload stays manageable.
Those are great points, Janelle. Thank you. Joann, I absolutely loved the chapter, Making Work Workable for Parents. And there were some incredible, impactful quotes, but you referenced a really powerful quote from one of your interviews, which is, flexibility is the fundamental defining change to make it possible for working parents to succeed. You can't work like you don't have children, or parent like you don't have a job. And it's really, really powerful. How can we educate women on how to make their voices heard to be able to live these quotes in reality?
Well, I'm glad you liked that chapter. And for anyone who is watching this program and doesn't have time to read the entire book, if you just read that last chapter, I think you will get a lot of inspirational guidance, because it does focus on how to make work more workable for not just women, but for women and men alike. Because until employers acknowledge the fact that men are parents as well, things are not going to get easier for women who are parents. We have to recognize that this is something that we're all trying to do. We're trying to raise the next generation. And to the point that you're raising, Vanessa, we have to acknowledge the fact that this is not a solo journey. And the way things are going to change, okay, the way you're going to be making your voice heard is not by being a single person crying in the desert. It's by joining forces. It's by finding out, for instance, whether the place where you work, does it have an employee resource group at all for employees? And if there are employee resource groups, join the one that's for parents, or join the one that's for women, or have the gumption to find a couple of colleagues who've got the idea to create one for parents or to create one for women. Secondly, it's very important that you find an executive sponsor. And you're going to need a different executive sponsor and a different executive mentor at different times in your career. And that has got to be someone who's not just, in an area that you know, but an area that you want to know more about, or who has already been an outspoken advocate for women. And those executive sponsors are not going to be all women. A lot of them are going to be guys, because we need to have allyship here. And so in order to have many voices heard, the voices have to be coming from men and women alike. And it's just really important to also make sure that you are networking outside of the workplace and connecting with women and men who are in your profession or in your industry, who can also act as not only advocates, but as sounding boards for techniques and various strategies that have worked in their workplace that enable their voices to be heard, particularly as they are women who are trying to move up in their careers. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, beautifully. And I think, sometimes we forget how important allyship really is. And I think we're hearing this word more and more across all areas. So that's a fantastic reminder. Janelle, power to versus power over is a great theme in the book Power Moms. If I'm a woman in a leadership position, how can I support women of all ages who are entering the workforce? And, I think I would love to hear your experience, both as a leader today and when you yourself were coming up the leadership track.
I was really fortunate, I think, in my career to work with great examples. Women that really led from the front, put people first, were great examples of how to be supportive, how to create a flexible work culture. When I think some of the great leaders that I've had and some of the things that have happened, it's almost shaped how I've been able to try and empower women in the workforce as well. I talked to Joann in the book about an experience that I had when I was very new to Adecco. So I suffered 2 miscarriages when I was brand new to Adecco. And what we talked a lot about in the book was the incredible amount of support and the transparent culture that I was in that really allowed for me to go through that in a very different way than I think some of my colleagues have at other companies. I was able to bring my true self to work, right? I was in a culture with leaders who didn't make it weird to talk about personal life at work. It was okay. People were comfortable talking about those things. So it made it easy that I didn't have to hide what I was going through. I also had leaders that were just so supportive, right? Jumping in to help. They made it very easy. They were empathetic. They gave a lot of transparency, right? In terms of what they could do to help me out. And it just was something that really stuck with me as a leader, right? As I continued to move up in my career, was how can I create that same type of culture? How can I make people feel like this is the type of culture where they can bring their full self to work, where I can be transparent about what's happening so that they feel comfortable? How can I lead with empathy, and how can I always put people first? And so when I think about that in terms of what we as women leaders can do, to me, it's about that, but it's also about, like you said, Vanessa, how can we give power to? How do we bring people up instead of pushing people down? I think there's this, horrible impression sometimes that women don't always support each other, but we can change that. We can be the change that we want to see in the workforce. We can be the mentor. We can be the ally. We can be the executive sponsors. Like, it's up to us to take that on and start bringing people up within our own workplaces.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, can I just chime in here? A lot of people have asked me, why did all these women cooperate and speak frankly on the record for this new book, as well as for the first book? And the answer is just the point that Janelle was just making. These women are all committed to paying it forward, because each generation of women is standing on the shoulders of the women who came before us and who had to battle even higher odds and even greater bias against women working in the workplace. And so to the extent that we can return the favor by paying it forward, I think that is a very powerful lesson.
And if I can add to that, Joann, I was really so incredibly impressed to see how many of the women from Power Moms were also interviewed and earning it. So you have a quote where you say they took a second bite of the apple. But it's amazing to see that how talkative they were, because the ideas in earning it really didn't reflect them as Power Moms. But Power Moms, they had a lot to say as well, and they had a voice that needed to be heard. So it's wonderful how collaborative, and to your point, they were willing to take a second bite of the apple, which I thought was a great quote. It was really good. Now, here's a question for you. We hear the term gendered ageism referred in the workplace. And I know that this isn't a concept that was a theme in Power Moms. However, I think with your experience and the research that you've done, I'd love to know why you think this practice exists, and how can women navigate past this?
Well, I think it's a greatly unrecognized issue. And there is a whole separate book that's recently come out on that topic that I would highly encourage people to go read. But I do think that it is an issue that women don't recognize enough is at work in the workplace. And I think that women start experiencing discrimination based on their age at, unfortunately, a relatively young age, probably at around 40. I'll never forget when I moved to London in the late 80s, there were still people running want ads in the newspaper where they were saying no one over 32 need apply. And so while that, of course, has gone by the way of the dinosaur, There are many, many more subtle examples that are still prevalent in the workplace. And the way you deal with that, if you particularly are an older job seeker who is a woman, is that you accentuate the positive. You accentuate what it is that you bring to the party in terms of not only your years of experience, but your wisdom and the fact that you have a track record of having been a successful mentor to younger women and men, and that you're willing to share that knowledge with people that you meet in the new job. Now, one of the things I did write about in a career column some years ago for the journal was the importance of making sure you're not the target of age discrimination, and doing so by limiting on your resume to jobs for the last 10 years. And if you've been in the workforce for more than 10 years, you just have a paragraph that summarizes where you've worked before without necessarily giving dates or even the names of companies. Because guess what? Companies change names or get absorbed. And so if you still got on your resume the name of a company that went out of business during the 2009 downturn, you're dating yourself.
That's great advice. That's really helpful advice. Janelle, we received many questions, several questions that asked, how do I know if this is in fact the workplace for me? And, would love to get your insight on what are some of the key indicators that a workplace should have established?
So I think from a workplace perspective, I'm going to break this up into kind of two answers here, Vanessa, because I think there's the culture and how do you know that it's the right fit for you, but then there's also what companies need to be addressing right now too. And I think that tied into a lot of the questions we received too around burnout, mental health, issues that continue to come to the surface that companies need to address. So I'm going to tackle the workplace and is it the right fit for me first? And when you evaluate whether or not you want to be working somewhere, I think you first have to define what exactly you need, right? So much has changed this year in terms of remote work and flexibility that maybe your needs have changed too. You may have been commuting to an office 5 days a week, and now that you've been working from home, you enjoy the fact that you can maybe spend time with your kids after work, or you enjoy that you can be remote a couple days a week. So my first recommendation is to make sure you really understand what you need, and then start asking questions of people that work there, of people that you're interviewing with. You can find out so much by asking about the way people work. How are they collaborating? What is the preferred way of communication? You'll be able to start to understand, are they an always on culture? Are there healthy boundaries around work life? And you'll be able to start to understand, is this somewhere where I can see my life fitting in? I think for a long time, we've always thought work is life. But at the end of the day, if these last 18 months have taught us anything, is that our life has to fit into work. And it's important to be able to ask those questions in a very direct way when you're interviewing companies and trying to figure out if it's the right fit for you.
That's amazing.
Can I add something to that?
Yes.
I think beyond trying to talk to people who are working at the company you're considering joining or the employer you're considering joining, go online and find people who've left the company, particularly people who are in the job that you are raising your hand for, because you want to find out why they left and what their experience was like, and what are the potential pitfalls as well as the potential upsides if you do decide to work there.
Yeah.
Joann, I was laughing at Janelle's always on because one of the power moms you interviewed talked about one of the shifts that she had a real impact on, which was we've gone from technology allow us to be always on to now we're sometimes always on. And that was one of the power moms in your book, which was a great culture shift for them. And Janelle, how would you advise someone on how to promote themselves when they have been out of the workforce for an extended period of time?
I think sometimes we think that being out of the workforce for an extended period of time is a negative, but it's all about how you flip that story. Because if you think about, I'm just going to use the example of somebody that's maybe been out of work through COVID, and you think about what you have actually done. You're a multitasker, you are handling all of the planning, you have dealt with adversity, you are patience, flexibility, empathy, tenacity. I could go on and on with the attributes that you bring to the table as a job seeker. So if you've been out of the workforce for a little while, forget about worrying that you don't have the hard skills or the job description that backs up exactly what you're looking for. Because I can tell you, as somebody that hires a lot of people, I look for those skills that I just mentioned, sometimes more so than somebody that's already done the job, because you need to have somebody that has a growth mindset, that can be flexible, that can adapt, because our world is constantly changing. It's going to continue to change, and you need people that can adapt to that. So my recommendation is to flip the script and start talking about it in a positive way, and find a way to relate that to the requirements that they're looking at for the job, and figure out how those pieces can fit in to really tell your story.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. I think we've all learned to move past from matching the skills and duties from the resume and the job description to, does this opportunity match my goals? And where is that alignment? So that's a great point. You know, one question that we received, and we received this, I think, in a few different ways, was, in your experience, do you feel that there are specific questions that I can ask to ensure the workplace will accommodate the needs of a working mom, such as the opportunity for remote work, without it looking like being a negative? What comments do you have around that?
I think the more direct you can be, the better. And because we've all been working remote for so many months now, you can absolutely use that to your advantage. So you can say and ask questions like, how have you managed this remote situation through the pandemic? What are your plans moving forward? Are you going to continue being remote? Are you going to have a hybrid schedule? I mean, I would say that in the past, we would maybe have to be a bit more indirect to try and understand some of those things, but we're in an environment now where every single company has an answer to that. Everybody is trying to figure out what is going to happen when they go back. Will they stay 100% remote, or will they offer some sort of flexibility? And what I see consistently with all of the clients that we work with and the companies that we talk to is that it is becoming recognized that people are going to continue needing flexibility, and that they want flexibility. So there are many companies that maybe had a more rigid schedule where you did have to come in 5 days a week that are now moving towards more remote. So just ask them and try to understand how they dealt with these last 18 months to get a real sense of it.
One question that, was posed almost as a concern was, as we see the world of work shifting to create really permanent remote work, how do I avoid getting lost in the shuffle of working remotely?
Yeah, this is a good question, because I think this is something that people have struggled with, having moved to more of a remote workforce. So the best piece of advice that I can give to anyone is that with your direct boss, establish some sort of a one-on-one cadence. Now, whether that's daily or weekly, whatever works best for your relationship, make sure that you have some sort of touch point that's on the calendar. And if there is not already some sort of formalized scorecard or KPIs that you're responsible for, create it. Come to that meeting with an agenda that speaks to what you're working on, the results you've accomplished, the problems you're experiencing, so that you can control the conversation with your boss. I can tell you that as all of us shifted, being on the other end of that with trying to schedule meetings and understand what people were working on, I appreciated when people came to the table with that type of proactiveness, because then it gave us a jumping off point. And we may have revised what it was we needed to talk about or see, but having that type of formality to it helped me as a manager really get a grasp on what was happening with all my employees that were suddenly scattered all over the country. The second piece I might recommend too is that because we're working in a more remote environment, is find ways to speak outside of that. So it's great if you have a weekly one-on-one with all of your stakeholders, maybe your direct boss and some of your colleagues that you're working on projects with, but find ways to have conversations outside of that. Because we no longer are in an environment where you can just stop by somebody's office and ask them about their weekend. So we are losing a little bit of that social piece. So the more that you can try to actually try to do that, right, and schedule some of those things or formulate ways that you can have some more organic conversations with people, will really also help you not get lost in the shuffle.
That's amazing. So I just want to point out, we had two additional questions queued up in case we had additional time, and these two hosts are so incredibly efficient with their answers. I think we're going to have time for both of them. So Joann, I'd like to direct this one question to you. In your follow-up conversations with the women that you have met and interviewed, how are these power moms adapting to the new normal of work post-COVID?
Well, it was something I was very curious about. And so I followed up last summer with 3 women who, at the point when I interviewed for them for the book, which was before the pandemic, were already working remotely. And again, these were women from the younger generation. And I was curious as to how that remote work environment had changed and they had adapted to it. And of course, the biggest change was for all 3 of those women is now the children were underfoot. Whereas when they were working remotely before, in 2 cases, they were working from home and the kids were not there. And in the third, she was at a remote office very close to her house and now, of course, was working from home. And so each one of them shared with me what I thought was a very effective strategy. And as we move forward to what invariably is going to be a hybrid work environment in which some of us continue to work either full or part-time remotely because that suits our lifestyle or our work preferences, we are going to have to know how to continue to be productive and effective. So one of those women who was working remotely for a company where it was 100% remote pre-pandemic, one of the things that she did to alter her situation was the point I was making earlier about adapting work-life sway. And so what she told her employer was that between 7 and 11 a.m. every day, she was going to exert her choice and have those be her protected hours. And so she was not going to be reachable. She didn't care how important the meeting was on any weekday between 7 and 11 because that was her personal time. That was her time to be with her daughters. That was her time to get stuff done that she needed to do that had to do with her family. The second approach was the one that Janelle already alluded to, which was the importance of having conversations, even if they're virtual, outside of the formal meeting place. And so this woman who had had a remote office, but her colleagues were all hundreds of miles and many states away, were ones that she rarely saw in person. She basically went back to headquarters at the most about once a month. She figured out the importance of having virtual coffees with one-on-one, not only peers, but people in other parts of the company so that she could continue to build her internal network and her allyship. And so she could find out what these colleagues not only needed from her, but how they could help her in return. And that's going to become especially critical to the extent that some people are in the office at the meeting and you're still attending it virtually. You want people who you've already built those virtual coffee inspired relationships with to speak up on your behalf and to make sure your voice is heard when you are attending those meetings virtually that other people are attending in person. And the third woman that I reached back to, at the point when the pandemic hit, both she and her husband were trying to start their own businesses. And in his case, he was working from home. She was working from a workspace for women. They both ended up, of course, being at home. And they had a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old who had to be essentially educated from home. And they tried to kind of wing it for the first week or two, and that wouldn't work. And so what they did is they put structure into place. They created a weekly calendar on a spreadsheet that they set up every Sunday night, and they essentially blocked out all the weekday hours from 7 in the morning to 8 p.m. at night as to who was going to be doing what, including their pre-scheduled work video calls. And they broke up each workday into a 3-hour segment. So everyone in that household knew, including the kids, when mom was going to be doing the virtual learning and when dad was going to be doing the baths. And again, life takes different directions. And while the weekly schedule worked for a while, they quickly realized they had to recheck once a night before bedtime. Is your schedule still what we agreed it was going to be on Sunday? So I thought all 3 of those were very, very useful tactics. And to the extent that you are going to continue to work remotely, particularly from home with children around part of that time, whether it's full or part-time, you ought to take them to heart.
That's great insight.
Joann, on that note about number 2, when you were talking about really, proactively reaching out and trying to understand the different people that are part of your sphere of influence, really, I found it really interesting when I came up to Canada. I've been remote this entire time. So I have an entirely new team, new clients, and I've met 3 people face to face. And so I bring that up because it's a good example that it can be done. I proactively spent so much time scheduling roundtables and coffee chats and meetings with clients and meetings with, colleagues, anything that I could do to try and make sure that I had a connection with people face to face. So it takes work, but if you kind of outline who it is that you need to get to and you start scheduling those things, you're going to feel like you're more plugged in to your workplace, even if you're remote. So I love that as something that came out in your book as well, because it's something I was able to implement and it really made a huge difference.
Great.
That's wonderful. And Janelle, I'm just curious, within your professional network, have you heard any interesting innovations or how some of the men and women in your professional network are adapting to the new normal of work post-COVID?
Yeah, I think that there has been a lot of introduction of new technologies, right, to help us be more productive. So I think across the board, I'm seeing a theme that people are looking at what are different ways that we can maybe look at repetitive tasks or non-value added tasks. How can we try to automate some of these things? Can we centralize some functions, right? If we're going to all continue to be remote, how can we change the way that we're working, right? Not just the workplace and where we're working, but the actual way we function. Because, I think some of us maybe still feel this way, but I know at the beginning of the pandemic, it was business as usual, but we're going to even throw more meetings on your calendar because now you can do more because you're remote. You're not traveling, you're not commuting. And we've really taken a step away from that to say, wait a minute, if we're going to continue this way, in order to ensure our teams are not getting burnt out, to make sure that people are truly getting the opportunity to have some separation between work and life, how do we change the way that people work? So that's a common theme, Vanessa. And like I said, I think some of the productivity tools that have come in, things like Teams, things like, different project planning apps, Slack, just different ways that we can communicate and look at doing things differently seems to be a pretty big push from everybody.
Could I add my 2 cents? Can I add my 2 cents? So I also think there's been a profound shift in kind of how we define, how we evaluate and measure people's performance. And so the work from home experiment, one thing it has proven is that we should assess people by their output, not by the hours that they work or what time of day that they work. And to the extent that that becomes sort of the new norm, that will be so helpful for the advancement of women, especially women with kids.
Yes, a big shift away from like more detailed KPIs that are driving activity towards outcome-based, right? So I agree with that 100%. I'm seeing that quite a bit, and we've done a lot of that even in our own organization.
And Joann, in your book, you talk about how, when you came back from having your daughter, you had to put your hand up several times to advocate for a flexible work schedule. And, it seemed like culturally working from home was a performance-based freedom and not a new way just to get your work done. So it's interesting how now it's really the default. And to your point, we're being measured on results, not the hours that you put in, and it shouldn't be based on performance-based freedom. It's how you work. It's how you're able to contribute to the organization and the results. So I thought that was a really powerful piece and you said it wasn't just once or twice. You had to put your hand up several times. And as an accomplished, you were a valued and accomplished member in your team, and you had to ask more than 3 times, you said, in order to get that flexibility.
But yet at the end of the day, when I was given the 4-day schedule that I was asking for, it was given to me on more generous terms than I had even proposed. And that was that I did not have to work longer days. I could work a shorter work week, and they were not cutting my pay or my benefits. And I never knew at the time until I then reached back to my then boss when I was reporting the book to ask, why did you give me this extra sort of whipped cream on top of what was the piece of cake I was looking for? And he said, because we worried that if we didn't give you that extra benefit of not cutting your pay, not cutting your vacation time, that you would have quit the journal and gone to work for a competitor. And so I think we have to remember that we are actually much more powerful than we give ourselves credit for. And we can exert influence over what happens to us and to our career direction as long as we take the measure of what we've done and take pride in those accomplishments and use that to leverage our situation.
That's an excellent point. I think, Janelle, we've seen all too often that, the cost of turnover is significant, and to lose the business intelligence, to lose the relationships built, it's not worth it to just keep the status quo of, well, we've always said no, so we should continue saying no. So you bring up an excellent point. I think even now in today's climate, and Janelle, please weigh in, the cost of turnover is such a significant decision maker in how we want to make workplaces work, both for men and women.
And we're seeing what's been coined as the Great Resignation right now, right? We're seeing it in the US and Canada. And the number one reason why people are leaving companies right now is because they are not getting the flexibility that they've become accustomed to. So as a leader or in your organization, the more flexibility and options that you can give to your teams, the more you will be able to retain your top talent. Because work has changed. The way we work has materially changed, and it's going to continue to stay this way. People are used to now being able to have more of that work-life sway and being more present because they've had it for the last 18 months. We can't ignore that. We can't just assume that things are going to go back to normal and that our colleagues and employees are going to want that. So I think it's really important to keep that in the back of our mind as we kind of move into this next normal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'd like to start wrapping up because I just was reminded of our time. And I just wanted to remind everybody on this webinar that our goal today was to offer you a fresh perspective, a new idea, a strategy that can move you into a career that you, your family, your colleagues will thrive in. But as well, it's a call to action. It's a call to action for all of us to continue the work done by the Trailblazers profiled in Joann's book, Power Moms, and advocate for workplaces that will work, not just for the next generation, but for this next normal. I'd like to thank Joann and Janelle for this incredible discussion that has hopefully encouraged you to evaluate your own life work sway and identify what you need in order to thrive in the workplace. I think the pandemic has taught us several lessons. It's taught us how quickly we can pivot when there is no other option, the ability of human beings to adopt and adapt to new ways of working, living, and educating our children, shifting how the work can get done, shifting how it should be measured, and the value of having the right support, allyship, and the ability to abandon the idea that we should be able to get it all done. We should be able to have it all and do it all. We have to abandon that. Joann interviewed 111 women in writing Power Moms, of whom 86 were executive working mothers, and the other 25 were adult daughters of the boomer generation. And we didn't have a chance to touch on that, but it is an incredibly compelling addition to this book on how this resonated as the daughters of these power moms, how they entered the workforce, the decisions, the choices, and the impact they made. So I just wanted to highlight that because it's such an important aspect and a concept in your book, Joann, that I just thought was incredible. But, overall, these trailblazers, they relentlessly advocated for workplaces that work for women. They advocated for it in earning it. They've advocated for it in Power Moms. And these gains have had a ripple effect on how women are represented in all levels of the organization, how adopting a work-life sway will improve their quality of life. And studies show that, and this is a direct quote from your book, Joann, that businesses with the most gender diverse leadership do generate higher profits. We know it takes a village, and we need to keep that door wide open that these trailblazers have kicked down for us. And I couldn't put this book down. I've got it like Janelle, I've got it right here. I reference it, I've got it bookmarked and posted. And Joann, I really admire that you continue to be a change agent and a role model for all women, regardless of where they're at in their career. And the fact that you go above and beyond, releasing your decades of research and expertise in your book, you participate in events like this, you donate your time to with corporate book club meetings, to name a few. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for voting with your time today with us. And I encourage everyone to visit Joann's website to learn more about the incredible work that she has done and continues to do so. Before I pass it over to Janelle to close us out, we will be announcing the winners of the hard copy of Joann's book after the webinar, and we'll be reaching out to you within the next 24 hours. So Janelle, over to you.
I'm just going to echo what Vanessa said, and thank you, Joann, for joining us today. It was truly a pleasure to have you come and speak about all the insights that, as Vanessa said, you poured into your books. I mean, we deal with the workplace and employing people and making the future work for everyone. So this is a topic that's just so near and dear to me, and something that I'm very passionate about in terms of really making sure that women are supported. So thank you, like Vanessa said, for voting with your time. And my call to action to all of you who joined us today is let's go out and be that change. Man or woman, we can implement this change that we do want to see in making workplaces thrive for women. So thank you all today. Have a great afternoon.
And thanks for having me, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.